Hey, what's up everybody? This is Osterberg501 and today I want to go over an anomaly power focus build for the Pyromancer that allows you to solo challenge tier 15 expeditions with gold times. Now before we get into the video, only 6% of people that watch my videos are subscribed to my channel. So make sure to subscribe if you want to keep up with all of my videos. Now, like I said, this can solo challenge tier 15 expeditions with gold times, but that is only some of the expedition maps. And the gear I currently have on this build isn't even close to being god rolled. I don't have any tier set bonuses yet, but with all that being said, you can still do specific maps on the highest challenge tier to farm up for the items you need. So first off, we have our skills, and first we have Heat Wave, which is our main spamming ability. It just sends out a fire wave in front of you that does damage and applies burn to enemies, and this is the main way we're also applying burn to enemies, which is very important for the overall damage of our build. And we will also be having 2 charges of this with the current mods in this build. Next, we have Overheat. Now this is one of the main things our build is focused around. So essentially, this hits pretty much any enemy that is currently spawned in on the map, and it does a smaller amount of damage to everything no matter what. But if you have burn applied to enemies, it does a massively increased amount of damage to all of those enemies. And a lot of this build is focusing on getting Overheat's cooldown to as low as we can possibly get it, because since expeditions and Outriders in general is so focused on having a lot of enemies, this is going to build up a massive amount of damage, even being used on enemies that don't have burn applied on them. Then we have Thermal Bomb, and you essentially just deal damage to an enemy, apply burn on them, and then if you kill an enemy with this applied on them, they will explode and deal a massive amount of damage to everything around them. This is kind of a supplement to help us apply burn to farther away enemies, and then be able to add some massive AoE damage if used correctly. This will also have 2 charges with the current mods we have. Next up, we have our class skill tree, and first we're going to go into 10% max health, and this is to get reduce ignite skills cooldown by 15%, so that's specifically for our heat wave. Then we have anomaly power, reduce the cooldown of our explosive abilities, which are our thermal bomb and heat wave. Then we have increased anomaly power, increases weapon and anomaly power, and then we have decreases all your cooldowns by 10%. This build is heavily focused on having the lowest cooldowns we can possibly have. Then we have increases your skill damage by 8% against marked enemies. Now marking is pretty much just hitting any enemy with an ability. Then increases our anomaly power. Then we do more damage against lower health enemies, which helps us to be able to execute low health enemies and finish everything off a bit easier. We have more increased weapon damage and anomaly power, more increased anomaly power. Then we have activating an explosive skill, increases your anomaly power by 12% for 10 seconds. This isn't a ton of anomaly power, but since we're using 2 of the abilities on this and it's for 10 seconds, this will be up 100% of the time, so it's still a decent damage increase. Then we have skill life leech. Then we have more anomaly power. We have resistance piercing. Then we have increases damage against elites, increases damage against marked enemies again, reduces our explosive skills cooldown again, so that's thermal bomb and overheat. And then finally we have increases your explosive skills base damage by 30%, so again that's our overheat and thermal bomb. So a lot of these skill points are just increasing the damage of our abilities and our anomaly power in general, and then massively reducing the cooldown of most of our abilities. So then we have our weapons. Now like I said, this build isn't incredibly well rolled. Like I said, I don't have a tier set bonus, which is pretty important. I don't have a few really important tier 3 mods to make this build much stronger, but we do have some decently stat rolled items, and then we have really strong weapons. If I didn't have some of these specific weapons, I don't think these armor pieces would allow me to get gold on Expedition 15 maps. So first off, we have our main weapon, Funeral Pyre, and the tier 3 that comes on this is Shadow Comet. You essentially just shoot something and it brings down a comet that does AoE damage, has a 3-second cooldown, does a massive amount of damage. And like I went over with one of my recent videos, if you use a shotgun with on-hit mods, you can proc the mod multiple times in a single hit. So you'll see if I shoot this into a group of enemies, it will call down multiple comets that all do the normal damage of the mod and hit in a radius. So if say you have an elite enemy with a bunch of enemies around it, you shoot this shot into it, it can proc a bunch of these shadow comets that can sometimes just like insta kill some elite enemies. So it's incredibly strong, and the main focus of using this weapon. Then we have Fortress, receive up to a 43% damage bonus based on your armor. So this is just a damage bonus. Whenever we have this weapon out, it increases weapon damage, mod damage, ability damage. It increases absolutely everything. So it's just a decent damage increase. With Pyromancer, we don't actually have a lot of armor. There's not really a way to tell how much Fortress is actually giving you. So I'm still doing some testing to see if Fortress is worth it on a Pyromancer with this build, because if you compare this to something like a Devastator is going to have a massive amount of additional armor compared to this build. So having Fortress on that is going to be worth, but there's a possibility that having another just strong proc mod might be better than having Fortress, but that's still going to require some testing. And our secondary weapon is Air of the Desert. Now this weapon is just something I switched to, shoot one shot to proc its mods, then switch back. And we have Sandstorm on this, which conjures a tornado that does over 200,000 damage over 5 seconds with a 5-second cooldown, and this can hit everything in an area. Then we have Ravenous Locust, which you apply this on a target, does over 250,000 damage over 10 seconds in an AoE, and also applies a weakness to everything in that AoE on an 8-second cooldown. Essentially, I'll just switch to this weapon, shoot an enemy once, and switch back, and it'll keep proccing this damage over time, applies weakness so enemies do less damage to me, and this actually will add a massive amount of AoE damage. Especially when proccing this on a group of enemies, you'll see that even on Expedition 15, some of the smaller enemies can just get killed just by both these mods proccing and dealing their full duration damage to grunt enemies. And then we have our armor pieces. Now our stat priority is going to go anomaly power, cooldown reduction, skill life leech, then status power. Those are the main things you're going to want to go for. So if you can get everything with anomaly power, cooldown reduction, skills life leech, those are going to be the best rolls. But status power over skills life leech can still be pretty decent. You might have to play a little safer without having as much healing with status power, but you're going to be doing a bit more damage. And also cooldown reduction is incredibly important. So anomaly power and cooldown reduction are weighted quite a bit heavier than skill life leech or status power, because this build is heavily focused on spamming out abilities and pretty much being a mage playstyle. So first we have Helmet of the Akari. This is the only legendary piece I currently have. At some point I'm going to do an updated video when I have this tier set bonus activated, because it's going to be incredibly strong. But this rolls anomaly power, skill life leech, status power, decent rolls. But the tier 3 on this is pretty important. Fire Tsunami, your heat wave has a bigger width, and as you see in the footage, it's pretty massive. This is to help us hit a lot more enemies and apply burn to a lot more enemies. Then I have Burnout Road on it, so enemies damaged by your heat wave take 25% more damage for 8 seconds. If it's on, say, a boss enemy, this will pretty much be up 100% of the time, so just adding a massive amount of damage increase. Then we have our chest, anomaly power, cooldown reduction, skill life leech. God rolled stats for me, and on this we have Tidal Wave rolled on, so we can use our heat wave twice before triggering our cooldown. So that's a massive amount of damage and a massive amount of applied burn to just enemies in general. Then we have Emergency Stance on this, which is our main defensive mod, and this is when you drop below 30% health, you gain Golem for 4 seconds with a 10-second cooldown, and Golem is a 65% damage reduction. Now I did go over a video in the past, because this mod is currently glitched. When it procs sometimes, it will just keep Golem on you 100% of the time. It won't keep the animation, but it will keep the buff on you. So just having this on an armor piece, at some point during every expedition, the proc will glitch, and then I'll have Golem up 100% of the time throughout the entirety of the expedition. Probably the strongest defensive mod currently in the game. Next up, we have our pants. Again, anomaly power, cooldown reduction, skill life leech, God rolled stats. And for the first mod, we have Sunburn. Increases the damage of overheat by 48,000 to the enemies that have their statuses consumed by the skill. When we have burn on enemies, then we overheat. That's what it's talking about, and just deals more damage to all those enemies. And that's our kind of big damage burst, is applying burn to enemies, then overheating and hitting everything that has burn on them for a massive amount of increased damage. And a really important mod for this build is Untamed Power. Anytime you use a skill, you deal 51,000 damage to enemies in a 5-meter radius around you, and this is scaling off anomaly power, so it will be increased when in combat and getting more buffs. Something that the mod doesn't say is this is also triggered off of melee attacks and doesn't have a cooldown. What you essentially become is, especially if you are facing one enemy or a boss enemy, you can use an ability melee, use an ability melee, and every single one of those will apply Untamed Power. So this can add a massive amount of damage. Getting used to meleeing enemies in between your abilities is going to add a massive amount of damage with this mod. Then we have our gloves. Again, anomaly power, cooldown reduction, skill life leech, god rolled stats. And on this, we have thermal bomb can be triggered 1 additional time. So now we can have it being used 2 times before the cooldown. And I rolled Captain Hunter on this to do more damage against elites, which is a pretty decent damage increase. Specifically with this build, you can actually have really bursty damage against elites or single enemies because of doing that rotation of ability, melee hit, ability, weapon shot, melee hit because of untamed power. If, say, you think you're dying a lot more or you have some other damaging mod that you want to use, you can change off Captain Hunter to something else. It just lets you kill the tankier enemies a little bit quicker. Then finally, we have our boots. Again, anomaly power, cooldown reduction, skill life leech, god rolled stats. Now this is something I could change, but I still need to get the legendaries that give me different mods, because the first one on this is if your heat wave damages 3 enemies, all other enemies past those first 3 will receive an additional 42,000 damage. This does add a decent bit of damage, but there are better mods. But like I said, most of those are going to be tier 3, and I have not gotten lucky to get those yet. And then a very important mod for this build is Pants on Fire. Increases your overheat damage by 48,000 to enemies who are damaged by the skill but don't have statuses consumed. If you use an overheat and an enemy doesn't have burn applied on them, it takes a much lesser amount of damage. But with this adds a massive amount of damage to those enemies that don't have burn applied on them. And with a lot of the expeditions, what this ends up doing is when you're going around killing all the elites, killing the tankier enemies, and using overheat on cooldown, usually by the time you're done killing all of the elites, all the tankier enemies, usually your overheats will have whittled down and gotten close to or killed all of the random grunts that are running around. So if you ever get annoyed of all the grunts sitting in cover halfway across the map, this mod with overheat usually will take care of those by the time you're done killing everything else. And the playstyle of this build in general kind of feels more like an MMORPG playstyle. It kind of has more of a rotation, especially if you're facing, say, a few elites or a boss, because essentially what you're going to want to be doing is using an ability, using a weapon hit, and using a melee. Those are the kind of 3 things you're going to be doing, and you're going to be cycling through all those. So say you'll heat wave an enemy, you'll overheat, you'll shoot them with your weapon, you'll hit them with a melee, you'll use another ability, because essentially what you're doing, you're just trying to constantly proc the mods on both your weapons, because those are going to add a massive amount of damage. You're trying to use your abilities for damage and the other effects they have, and then you're also trying to throw in melees in between all of that to proc untamed power more times, which is also already being procced by your abilities. So essentially it's abilities, weapon shots, melees, and you're just cycling through all of those, trying to damage as many enemies with each one of those as you possibly can. So subscribe if you want to see more Outriders or other videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about this build, and thanks for watching.
I'm dealing with. Support incoming!
Coast looks clear. That's one of our procs. Naturally, it's landed on the insurgents. Get it. Remember that freak I fought last time? The one who nearly buried me alive?
Am I gonna have to dig you out of the rubble again?
Outrider
Not
detected.
this time.
Access granted.
He's sung his last. And the pod's ours.